Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly global podcast where we do deep dive interviews with national and international experts, authors, artists, and journalists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And we include your questions and comments and remind you, if you've not yet become a member of this podcast, we cover a wide range of intellectually engaging topics and issues and are distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. So to join and become a member, simply go to graymatter.show. That's Gray with an E. In this episode, we talk with a leading American journalist, author of 6 books, journalism professor at the City University of New York. Jeff Jarvis joins us, media columnist for The Guardian and president and creative director of Balance.net. He blogs with buzzmachine.com and co-hosts the podcast This Week in Google. Recently, he testified before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Journalism. And we welcome Jeff Jarvis to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Good to have you.
Michael, I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Well, honored to have you, and I know you were honored to go before that Senate subcommittee, and we'll talk about that. I wanted to also say that you've had what I describe as a distinguished and storied career as a journalist and as an academic, created Entertainment Weekly, an executive with Condé Nast. I didn't even mention half of your bona fides, but also a critic for TV Guide and a columnist for the San Francisco Examiner, in my memory, a bank, of course, and work for People magazine, new book by Celebrity Nation I mentioned to Jeff earlier on by Lanny Jones. I'll give a plug because little did I know that he was quoting an article of mine to end that book. He was the managing editor for years of People, so he was your boss there, I guess. But let's begin talking about one of your books. There's a new one on magazines, but I think the 5th book was The Web We Weave, and it was all about the future of the internet. Subtitle, What We Must Reclaim About the Internet from Moguls, Misanthropes, and Moral Panic. The message is kind of stay away from fixing and regulating the internet, isn't it?
Well, this book is not out until the fall, but I want to be careful that I am in favor of regulating all human activity. We do that in every way. The internet is already regulated. What I wrote the book for was to defend the freedoms that the internet has brought, especially to those who didn't have those freedoms in the hegemony of old mass media run by people who look like me, old white men. And I fear that moral panic around the internet, there's many examples of it. Jonathan Haidt has a new book out right now claiming that phones are the ruin of a generation. Lead to stupid regulation that can impinge upon the freedom of expression by doing things like shrinking fair use and expanding copyright and banning TikTok and taking away the platform that people use to finally have their voices heard.
You are not in favor of banning TikTok?
No.
Because?
Because of the First Amendment, first and foremost, because I think there's a bigotry about China in American politics right now. Not that they aren't a bad government. They are, and they do bad things. They do. But the platform enables all kinds of people to speak who otherwise couldn't. Yes, they could go to a different platform. That's true. They could start a blog. That's true. But there's something unique about TikTok that I think is the first medium for the connected age because it enables collaboration more than any other I've seen so far. And the voice of it is wonderful, and I'm on it every day, and I find people I love, a critical chef who hates the crap that's being cooked there, a brilliant organist named Anna Lapwood, all kinds of people I can point to who bring me joy. And what happens in media coverage, my book turns into, more than anything else, a critique of media's moral panic about the internet, is that media jump upon one easy solution. This is the essence of a moral panic for all of our problems, thus not paying attention to the greater problems that we actually have in society. And what I argue is that the internet is not a technology, it is a human network, and all that is good and all that is bad about it is us.
And technology is neutral in your opinion, right?
No, I don't think there's anything such thing as neutrality, however. Just as I don't think that there's anything journalistic objectivity is possible either.
We agree on that.
Technology can be, good, I'm glad. That saved us an hour. Technology can be used for good or bad. And the point is that we have choices, that we need to learn from technological transitions in the past to see where those choices have been good and have been bad.
Well, let me be devil's advocate for a moment, because the real argument on TikTok is that the Chinese are gathering data on it. Now, that may be paranoia, but nevertheless, they own TikTok. And the other arguments about the internet would sort of go something like this, that it does create addictions, it does make us stupid, it spies on us, or at least has the capability of spying on us. All those things notwithstanding, can we really reach a notion of impartiality or of just accuracy? Because those are really necessary for good journalism, aren't they?
The word data, I fear, has become a scare word. And that worries me alone, because data are information, and information is the basis of knowledge. And when we say that, oh my God, somebody's gathering data, well, let's talk about the real harm involved first with that. What are the Chinese going to do with the fact that I watch this crazy chef guy, Chef Reactions? It's hard for me to see the harm. Now, on the other hand, if I were a woman living in half the states in America right now, and my phone showed that I visited an abortion clinic, that is privacy to be worried about. But the agent of that case is the government, who says they protect us from these things. So does our data matter? Sure, it does. Does privacy matter? Yes, it does. But I think that there is a moral panic going on about this. And what worries me is that there's also the opportunity for us to share and be generous with each other. I had prostate cancer and I had thyroid cancer, and I wrote about both of those on my blog, and people thought I was insane for doing so. But that was A, my choice, and B, I got value back for it. And I think that sharing can be an act of generosity. And we shouldn't lose sight of that in this media-based moral panic about TikTok and the internet.
The internet does create a moral panic. I think that's a given. How can that be, to some extent, ameliorated, or does it need to be ameliorated?
I think history helps. In that book and in another one about print, I looked back at moral panics past. The novel was going to be the ruin of women's morality and of children's lives. There are some great quotes I have in the book about someone saw a woman was ignoring her children because of reading a novel, and her children were going starving because of it. We've heard the same thing said about the internet and phones and video games and everything else. They were ruining children. They were ruining women. The sexism of all this moral panic is apparent as well. And so first thing we need to do is to look at the history of this. The second thing is to recognize, and I've seen this more and more, that in time, the technology and the technologists recede in their visibility and power. The other book I have out now is called The Gutenberg Parenthesis, in which I look at the transition into the age of print. And it wasn't, one of the great lessons for me in researching that was that it wasn't until 150 years after Gutenberg before we saw tremendous innovation with print. The creation of the modern novel with Cervantes, with the essay with Montaigne, of a market for printed plays with Shakespeare, and the newspaper. And so what that tells me, number one, is I think we have time to adjust to and understand what the internet and AI are. And number two, we still see the future in the analog of the past. Very McLuhan, all media are built on the media prior. And number three is that, and I'm paraphrasing Clay Shirky of NYU here, what the technology gets interesting when it gets boring. And so when print was no longer a mysterious, difficult technology, that's when interesting things happened with it. And I think the same is going to happen with the internet and even AI, especially now that AI is a literate machine and we can talk to it in our own languages.
Didn't you say that trying to control AI is like telling Gutenberg that movable type would never be in use?
Yeah, it's also trying to blame, it would be like blaming Gutenberg for everything bad that people do with it. I was in San Francisco a few months ago, and I'm coming back next month for a World Economic Forum event on AI governance. And what I saw in the discussion there fascinated me. Was that there's a debate going on as to who should be held responsible and accountable for AI and its perils, right? And there's three layers here. One is the layer of the technology, the people who make the large language models. They make the algorithms. Well, the problem is that it's a general machine. It can be made to do anything. So can they be held responsible for? Can they be expected to build guardrails against everything that every malign human being could ever imagine to do with it. The next layer down is the application layer. So when Air Canada puts up a bot and it lies to its customers and Air Canada tries to blame the bot, no, it's Air Canada's fault. The next layer down is the user. And there, I covered the federal hearing for the infamous lawyer who used ChatGPT to come up with case citations for a filing. And that was his fault. So if we go back to print, the same thing happened. At first, the technology was held to account, and printers were beheaded and behanded and burned for what came off their press. Then it was the intermediaries. It was the booksellers and the publishers. And then finally, it was the authors who were held to account. And that, says Foucault, is when we had the creation of the notion of the author when they could be punished.
So, for example, if Meta puts out blatant fakery, they can't be held accountable, or they should be held accountable?
Well, let's cut apart. Let's parse that Meta puts out. It may well be that someone asked for it, a human being, and made something, made the tool with it. Same. Let's look at a printing press. If I write a packet of lies in a book or a pamphlet, do we still hold the printer accountable, or do we hold me accountable? And then the next question is, well, Meta puts out. Well, Meta probably didn't choose to put this out. It was a user who chose to share it and to use the mechanism to do that. Is Meta faultless? No. Should Meta have some responsibility to try to do something about these kinds of things? Yes. But can we hold them accountable for all bad human acts that people imagine to do on that network? That's ludicrous.
Now, you've said essentially at one point that the future of the book was maybe dim, or words to that effect. And you're also saying the same about what we call the old style journalism, old school journalism. I mean, newspapers, magazines, for that matter, local television news, things of that sort. Is there a possibility that you're wrong about that, like you were about the book?
So to be clear, that it was a book I wrote some years ago called What Would Google Do, where I said that the book should be updated and linkable and clickable and searchable, and that we held it too holy and we weren't going to change it. In my most current book, in which I study the history of books, the Gutenberg parenthesis, I'll give you the spoiler here. The afterword says I recant. And the last words in the book are, let the book be the book. So I was wrong about books. I think they are an institution against which we can judge our cultural work going forward. As for newspapers, it's never been the newspaper that I care about. It's the journalism. It's the service to communities. The problem right now, I'm about to finish a paper about the California Journalism Preservation Act, which has been through the Assembly, is now in the Senate of California. And it's an act written by lobbyists for the large newspaper companies. Last I looked, 18 of the top 25 newspapers in California were controlled by hedge funds. And they're not innovating and investing in news. They're cutting staffs to the marrow. Their products are awful. Gannett and McClatchy just cut off the Associated Press, which is about all the news they had. I finally come to the conclusion that they are not worth supporting. Now, that's not to say that everything old isn't worth supporting. There are black newspapers in your state that are 100 years old that are well worth supporting. There's community media, diasporic media, digital media. There's all kinds of things in a large ecosystem to support. So to equate news with the newspapers we have today, that's the mistake.
Well, you talk critically about Congress being an echo chamber and about the unwillingness to look toward what you and I think, are both solidly behind: community journalism and journalism that represents what the community wants, what the community feels is necessary, and so forth. So we're talking about the corporatization of traditional old media, and the lobbyists do represent that corporatization. That's something that doesn't seem to be able to change. I remember, in fact, just a quick reflection, your thoughts about, I remember once Phil Bronstein, who was the editor of the San Francisco Examiner, as well as the Chronicle, was in a event that I was in with Craig Newmark. And he said, it's over for us. It's, kind of doom time. I didn't use those words, I'm paraphrasing. But people like Craig have come along and they've essentially usurped those who want to buy advertising. So it gets down to dollars. Who's going to put the dollars into old media, and they don't find that those dollars really, even if it's the hedge funds, those dollars don't pay back. What's the average age of a newspaper reader now? About 55?
Yeah, still younger than us, I think, but yeah, getting old. But I think I want to zero in on the word you use, corporatization, because we can look at a point in time when that occurred. Before the mechanization, and I mean, go back to Gutenberg. Gutenberg's technology fundamentally did not change from 1454 to about 1800. And then, thanks to other technologies, we saw it change radically with steam-powered presses and the linotype and so on. It was in the mid-19th century then that we saw the mechanization and industrialization of print. Before that time, the average circulation of a daily newspaper in the United States was 4,000. It was a good Substack newsletter or podcast. If you could get people to pay, all of your people to pay you $20 a month, you have a very nice little business. Is it venture capital investable? No. Is it a huge business? No. But is it big enough? Yes. And then we see other steps in this corporatization. In 1894, I think it was, Frank Muncie's magazine was selling for 25 to 35 cents. It wasn't selling. He decided to sell it for 10 cents at a loss for each cover. How do you make money? Advertising. Thus was born the attention economy that plagues us to this day, even into the internet. Then we see the 1920s, we started a first competitor, which is radio. And also in the 1920s, we get Henry Luce creating Time Inc. And with it, the first major media corporation and the corporatization of media indeed. And I think what we've seen, Michael, is a few story arcs. One is for print media, which isn't going to die, but it becomes superseded in some influence from Gutenberg to today, thus the Gutenberg parenthesis. And we see another arc here for mass media, which is from, I think, the 1890s with the linotype as the last machine necessary and with the business model having arrived in terms of advertising support until now. That is to say that nothing is forever. And it's not as if the natural state of things is to have singular monopolistic newspapers in markets acting as if they serve everyone, because they never did. You and I are old enough to remember Walter Cronkite ending every show with, "And that's the way it is," when for many Americans, it was not the way it was. And it's a myth that we have in this country that we were better off with that white hegemonic power-based view of our country. So I think we have the potential to go to something better. But as Clay Shirky, to quote him again, says, we're likely to have a lot of chaos between here and there.
You mentioned Henry Luce. I know you work for Time Magazine. I'm reminded of something that Bertrand Russell said that always stuck in my mind, because the Luce Corporation included Claire Booth Luce and was not only Time Magazine, but Life, which is now coming out again with one of the Kushner brothers, Kushner's nicer brother, I guess, than Jared. They're selling Life magazine. It reminded me of Bertrand Russell saying, "Time is for the people who can't think, and life is for the people who can't read," which always sort of stayed in my.
Well, and full disclosure, I was worse. I worked for People. When I left San Francisco, Jim Wilsey, who was one of my favorite people on the earth, who was at the Examiner at the time, and I told him I was leaving the Examiner to go to New York and People. He said, "So, tired of journalism, huh?"
Well, I once, somebody interviewed me, and I have this, for better or worse, at this stage of life, reputation as being somewhat intellectual or cerebral. And I said that I really enjoyed reading People magazine because there was a kind of gossip quality to it. And I'm a literary guy, and Proust said all literature is gossip. So I go with that to some extent. We get a lot of the history of journalism from you. I've got some questions coming in for you, and I want to go to those questions. I'm also just wondering if we could talk for a minute about AI to a little greater degree, because we've been focusing on it and so forth. The gospel is, I think what you've called the gospel is, AI companies should license and pay for all media content they are putting out there or they are involved in. And I think you made the analogy to the world of radio, which we both thrived in. It's like rip and read. That's how it started. And that's how AI is starting. You got fair use here. You've got senators who are arguing that copyright becomes meaningless, and you disagree with that. Why do you disagree with that?
So as I look back at the history, again, I have this paper coming out about the California Journalism Preservation Act, full disclosure, that is solicited by the California Chamber. And for that and for the books I've done, I look back again at history. And the newspaper industry again and again has followed the same script. It starts with the first competitor for print in history, which was broadcast radio in the 1920s and 30s. And at first, newspapers saw this as a hobby and a toy for people. And then when it started to become a business, they got quite scared of it. And they tried to keep radio out of their business in a number of ways. And each of these cases, we're going to see they try to shrink fair use and expand copyright. Because news was not copyrighted until the 1909 Copyright Act. It did not have any protection whatsoever. And even then, it was questionable as to how protected it was. Well, the newspapers tried to clamp down, and they strong-armed a bunch of the two major networks at the time to kill their news divisions, their nascent news divisions, to agree to have only 2 5-minute bulletins a day, to have no advertising associated with news, and this relevant to your career, to disallow on-air commentators for talking about any news until 12 hours after it occurred. They did some other dirty tricks. They got broadcast regulated. The FCC followed. And then they said, well, if this regulated medium is beholden to government, then they can't possibly cover government, so they shouldn't be allowed into the congressional galleries. They argued that radio was not an appropriate medium for information because people think with their eyes, not with their ears, and it was bad for democracy. Now we replay that script with television. We replay it again when the R-Box, the Baby Bells, got to be able to go into information services, and with the internet, where they're trying to expand copyright, and again now with AI. And so in the hearing in which I spoke in Washington, the argument of the lobbyists who surrounded me with the legislators who were before me was that AI companies should have to license and pay for anything that's copyrighted. Well, everything is copyrighted, number one. And number two, this is information that is freely available on the internet. I'm holding an event with the Common Crawl Foundation on April 30th to examine these issues. They scrape the entire, they crawl, the entire internet, only the things that are free, never going behind paywalls. Well, now media companies are trying to argue, and to read it, maybe one more thing, to read news and learn from it and use the information in it is what journalists do every single day in their job. But they're trying to say that the machines or the companies that own the machines can't have the same right. And they're trying to diminish fair use as a result. And that is offensive to me from a First Amendment perspective, a journalistic perspective, that journalists should have lobbyists, and from the perspective of free expression.
This gets down to Section 250. Can you amplify a bit on that? 230, excuse me, yeah.
It does and it doesn't. 230 has become the scapegoat for everything that people want to do about regulating the internet. 230 is brilliant legislation passed in the 90s that anticipated that if we didn't have the sword and the shield that it offered, then the internet would never have become a place for public discourse. Let me explain. The internet says to a online service, whether that's Meta or whether that's the San Francisco Chronicle, anyone who has the public doing things on their site or the questions that you're about to hear from, that you're not responsible for the content they create, so that you have some safe harbor. That's the shield. But you also have a sword. You have the right, I would say responsibility, to moderate that content, to have your standards. So you're going to see some question that comes up, I doubt it from your smart audience, but you could see one that was offensive, and you will choose in your editorial prerogative not to read it. That is your choice. 230 is under attack from both the left and the right. From the left, they say, you should get rid of all this hate speech. And the right says, whoa, that was our hate speech you got rid of. How dare you? And the left says these companies are too big and powerful. And the right says, especially in Texas and Florida, that these companies should be forced to carry even their noxious political speech. And in any case, what they're doing is restricting the freedom of expression of platforms and publishers. Because if someone came to you, Michael, and said, you must have person X, you must have Elon Musk on your show, and you say, no, I don't want to. No, sorry, you have to have him on your show. Not to do so is a violation. You must do it. Well, that's a violation clearly of your freedom of expression. Choice is also speech.
So what do we do about bias? What do we do about prejudice? What do we do about bigotry?
We have to go to the core of it. If we turned off the internet tomorrow, what do we think? People are suddenly going to become hugging in the streets and fine? No. We brought all of our biases and prejudices and limited worldviews to all of these technologies, to the internet and to AI. And to act as if that suddenly the technology made us this way has blinders on. No, we have major problems as a society, the same problems we had before these technologies. And if we blame it on the technology, then once again, we avoid dealing with the underlying malign nature of our society.
Let me begin with some of the questions that are coming in. This is from CJ, who's in Dowington, Pennsylvania. He says, I appreciate your pragmatic take on issues that others tend to sensationalize. How can we motivate more publications to take a similar and sensible approach when their competitors are selling borderline clickbait? And I would just add to that, what do we do about clickbait? And what do we do about the fact that, well, the media in general has become tabloidized, in my judgment, and I think probably you see things similar.
CJ, it's an important question, and I think it's what you're getting to is the core of it all, which is the business model for media. And I directed a center. I'm leaving the university and going to another one soon, but for 15 years, I directed a center on entrepreneurial journalism. I failed to come up with the answers, but I think that the attention economy that media invented, that was then imported into the internet, causes this clickbait. It also says that it makes us terribly inefficient as a field because we end up copying each other because it's cheaper and easier to do that. And we try to fool people into clicking on us. We have to reinvent, I think, journalism at its core, media at its core. Now, is advertising corrupting? It can be, but we can't afford to do without advertising. So we also have to invest, I think, some effort in reinventing advertising around quality and trust. Ben Smith, the former editor of BuzzFeed, now the editor at Semaphore, wrote a very good book called Traffic. And it made me see that BuzzFeed and Vice and Gawker were not the vanguard of new media we thought that they were. They were the last gasp of old media. They wanted traffic for traffic's sake. They made that into a science. They managed to get huge amounts of traffic, but then everybody else figured out the same tricks and they did the same thing. And it kind of ruins Google for us. It ruined social media for us. We've got to shift around. And then along comes 2016 and all the problems that came in disinformation. And so we spend a lot of effort today thinking about how do we get rid of all the bad stuff. I think that's a natural first step. It happened with print too, but I think we have to turn around.
It's still about traffic, really, isn't it?
Not necessarily. You're not about traffic. You're about trying to get a relationship with an audience. Some nice people who are right now listening to us live see fit to pay you so that it can be free to others. That's not about traffic. That's about a quality, authoritative relationship.
Still, those who want to monetize, if they're doing podcasts or if they're doing any kind of media, need the traffic. I mean, it is vital. It's like, how many responses you get to a posting on Facebook, how many likes do you get, or that sort of thing. In fact, the guy I used to work for in my radio career used to say, this was in commercial radio before I went into public radio, used to say, well, actually, we were trying to get traffic there too. You want to get pledges, it's the same concept in a way. But he would say, it's like you're having a party and you want to get as many people to the party as you possibly can. That's the ethos. That's what we live by. He didn't use that language. That's my language. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, that's the mass media view, is that biggest is best. But I don't think that's really the case. The question is, what's big enough?
That is the question.
You don't need to have the audience that KGO had in the heyday. I'm sure you'd like to have it, but you're not going to have it because there's too much competition. You don't need to have it. What's enough so that you can feed on more than ramen noodles daily? That's the question. And that's hard. That's not easy. We haven't fully cracked that yet. But I think that we're coming to the end of mass media and trying to invent what follows.
Well, we can talk about some of the things you've invented or you've been involved in the collective invention of and trajectory that's moving forward, like entrepreneurial journalism, which we actually talked to recently in a podcast we did. But let me go to some more questions here. We're getting some really good questions, thoughtful questions, as we always do. Susan from Charlotte, North Carolina, do you think our leaders understand technology well enough to effectively regulate it?
Great question, Susan. The quick and glib answer is no, they don't. But we're stuck with them. So what we have to do is educate them, or more to the point, frankly, educate their staffs. Part of the problem is that politicians also live on clickbait. They live on easy solutionism to get headlines in media that also like clickbait, and it feeds on each other. And it's hard to get wise legislation out, obviously, especially today. I do think it's possible to educate them. I think it's possible to have a dialogue about this. There is a version of the California law, the CJPA, that was proposed in Illinois recently. And ego that I am, I put my name on the list to go testify before the Illinois Senate. And did, and I wasn't alone, but there were those of us who pointed out all of the flaws in the legislation. And at the end, they didn't put the bill forward. And they said, surely we can find better things to do than this. And I think that if presented properly with enough of the evidence, we have the chance to convince them. But there's another piece of legislation called KOSA, the Keeping Kids Online Safe, Kids Online Safety Act. I think that's what it is, which is a product of moral panic. Who's going to be against protecting kids online, right? Well, okay, but the specifics of the legislation are dangerous to free expression, not going to help kids. It's a real problem, but it gets huge bipartisan support because it hits on that emotional line of protecting children online. And so we need some way, I think, to get to smarter discussion. There's a book out right now this week by Jonathan Haidt, who I frankly can't bear much, who writes about children and safety and presumes that it's all the fault of the phone. The correlations that he sees are not causation. I think it's sloppy work. There's a wonderful review against it that just came out today in Nature. And the problem is that Haidt gets on every TV show, and tell me he hasn't been on your show yet.
No, I've interviewed him in the past, but not here.
All right.
But see,
Not this time around.
in the interest of, I don't believe in objective journalism. I don't think it exists, but in the interest of kind of fairness and everything, I'd like to hear what he would say in response to what you just said. And there's value in that as a journalist.
Yeah, there is. We need that discussion.
I would just add one thing. In fact, this is probably a red flag even more than Jonathan Haidt, but you have a bête noire, and I wonder how you respond to him. I'm talking about Rurik Bradbury, who has set himself up as basically your enemy. He says you have too much online influence. It doesn't equate with the thoughtfulness, a lack of thoughtfulness, I guess he would say, of what you put out there. I mean, it's an indictment of your work, and so you come on here. I'd love to hear what you have in response to him. Some would say I shouldn't ask Jeff a question like that because it may be tricky, and I will concede that initially. But I'd like to hear what you have to say, and then I would like to hear what he has to say, back and forth.
I would like to hear what he had to say if he said it to me as himself. Instead, what he did was create an imposter that confused people, that got people mad at me for what he said, and he hid behind his glib and not very funny attacks. And so I have not read a single word of his in at least 4 years. He doesn't come across my radar. I don't care. One of the simple rules of online is don't feed the trolls. Block them, don't argue with them. And he's a troll. And so I don't bother with him. There's plenty of people who disagree with me, plenty of people with whom I get discussions. Haidt and I have gone back and forth on Twitter as well. I'm happy to have those discussions. I think that it's you're right. It's vital that we have discourse on these issues, but that discourse needs to be informed. And the problem with Haidt's book, so Haidt says that phones are addicting. He finds correlative data that says that suicide went up in young people since the phone. Others say, and I quote this in my book, well, the problem is he only quotes data from this century, when in fact in 1990 for young men, the rate of suicide was much higher than it is today, long before the phone, long before the internet. That's the kind of discussion we need to have, is about research.
I have to ask you if you know The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe.
Long ago in my youth.
Well, it was about a young man who was led to suicide by his own volition because he couldn't get his unrequited love to pay him any attention or to love him. As a result of that book, there were thousands of suicides of young men. I mean, this can be, there's the book again, the influence of the book.
There was also a moral panic about romantic literature.
Well, I mean, you can do with data lots of things is really my point.
Exactly.
When we talk about data before. Although, have you read Harari or have Yuval Harari?
Some.
Because he says it's all about data now. And he makes a real case.
Yes, but as you just said, data can be interpreted in many ways. And the problem becomes, again, I'm not a real academic. I'm just a journalism professor. I'm a poseur in the palace here. But if you go to people who are actual researchers, who understand how to look at data in holistic ways, the problem with Haidt and company is they pick one cause and center on that. And it's never that simple. As Taylor Lorenz of the Washington Post says in response to Haidt, if you ignore the traumas of young people today, the climate going downhill, young women have no control over their bodies. They're afraid of being shot in school. We're facing the potential of fascism in the future. But yeah, blame the phone. That's the problem. We have to look at things in a broader sense with the humility to know that we don't know the causes and the answers. All we can do is try and be open to understanding differing perspectives as we try and be willing to admit when we fail.
A perspective that would suddenly be labeled by those on the right as being a leftist perspective, which you just articulated.
I started looking back at the anti-intellectualism of the 50s and 60s in the States. And there too, it's useful to look at history and the lessons of the past and what led to McCarthyism. The labeling of what is called a closed mind today by those on the right, frankly, who think that they're being canceled, and they use their huge megaphones to complain about their cancellation, gives lie to their complaints. They're not being canceled. They can be out there complaining constantly all the time. They don't have a right to be heard by everyone. They don't have a right to be amplified by everyone. They don't have a right to have you carry all of their speech. They have a right to speak. They also don't have a right to speak without criticism and without contrarian views. But they tend to think that that's what they wish. You know, I have a theory here that a lot of what we're seeing in America, the supposedly divided country, and I think that itself is a red herring, is that print enabled, it did not cause, but it enabled the Reformation. Without print, Martin Luther might have been burned at the stake like Jan Hus, his predecessor. But with print, he was able to start a movement. And along came as well, obviously, the Counter-Reformation and the 30 Years' War, and much source to follow. And I wonder today whether what's happening is that the internet gives not voice, people have voices, but gives the opportunity to be heard to people who, again, were not heard in white mass media. And it is the old white hegemony that resents that. And that is Black Lives Matter, the Reformation of the internet, and was January 6th, the Counter-Reformation. So if we allow ourselves to interpret insurrection and fascism as if it's just the other side of an argument, as if it's the other side of a balance of left and right and so-called center. We talked earlier about not believing in neutrality or objectivity. I also don't believe there's such a thing as a center, because that too is too simplistic.
But we're not politically divided? That's a red herring?
We've always been. We couldn't hear it because hegemonic media hid those voices from us. I think that what I really learned in the Gutenberg parenthesis is that society before print was obviously conversational. And even in the early days of print, it was conversational. There was Martin Luther in discourse with the Pope and burnings of their books and so on, and Erasmus and Sir Thomas More and so on and so on. Print was conversational until that moment, which I mentioned earlier, the mechanization, industrialization of print, the beginning of mass media, the monopolization of print by a few rich people and corporations. Well, now the internet breaks apart that monopoly, and now more people can be heard. And this cacophony we hear is unsettling because we're not used to it, but that is the sound of democracy.
So the internet
what we have to do
is not only a democratic tool, but it's something that really goes counter to hegemony, you're saying.
Yes.
By its very
again,
nature.
not to say it can't be misused. It can't be controlled. See China and Iran and so on. We can make bad decisions around it, like getting rid of Section 230 would be a bad decision. But in its essence, it enables anyone to speak to anyone.
Well, here's a question back to TikTok. Trish from Tampa says, does the real danger of TikTok lie in the ability for a country that has proven to be a clear adversary of the United States to affect public sentiment or even just create a massive waste of time-lowering productivity?
Well, at the end of a long day, I'm fine to reduce my productivity, so I'll defend that. Let's go to the prior part of the question. Sure, but let's remember that there are many nations on earth that say that America is just that danger. When it comes to our media that goes out around the world, even Canada to the north passed laws to prevent American media from taking over all of Canadian media. So, we do it too, in that sense. The other part of this is I think we have to have more faith. And this is going to sound odd in a time when half the country votes for an insane man, but we have to have faith in our fellow citizens. And when we don't, when we think that everybody else is an idiot and everybody else can be influenced by China, then that's called the third person effect, where everybody else is vulnerable, except, of course, you and me, and I'm not too sure about you. And we put ourselves at a higher level, on a pedestal above everyone else. That's a dangerous and hubristic thing to do.
But there is adversarial things to call and summon here. I mean, China has been stealing our technology for years and continues to do so, I mean, rampantly. And China sends balloons to surveil us. I mean, there's all of those kinds of things which are pointing to what ought to be maybe serious concerns.
My problem with China is not what it does to us, it's what it does to its own citizens.
That's a problem with the Uyghurs, yes. I mean, especially
the Uyghurs and every citizen.
Yeah.
The fact that they use the internet to spy on their citizens and give them social ratings and determine what they're allowed to say and not allowed to say. I find that all horribly offensive. And I also get very offended when I hear some people say, well, China's not ready for democracy. Well, we don't know because we can't hear their voices.
Well, the reasoning that I've always thought of is that China never really had imperialistic designs beyond the Asian continent. I mean, even, you say look at history. I look at history that way. Are they trying to take over the world? Are they, like the Nazis were or like the Soviets were for that matter? Probably not. But at the same time, they want Taiwan, they want Tibet, they want the South China Sea, and, well, we need to go on there. I've got some very direct questions for your areas of expertise, like Ned in Tulsa, Oklahoma says, what are your opinions about DOJ versus Apple?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Well, so I should first tell you that I'm on a podcast every week called This Week in Google. So I live La Vida Google. I have an Android phone, a Chromebook. I don't tend to use much in the way of Apple products. And thus I tend to peeve the Apple fanboys. But I think that the DOJ and the FTC are each trying very hard to go after big tech because it's a popular thing to do. And the problem is the cases, to my mind, haven't been terribly strong. I don't think Apple has a monopoly. Are they always nice? No, they do things that aren't nice, but so does my phone company. So does my cable company. So do airlines. So where are the lines there and why go after them now? So I'm not saying that there isn't anything of merit in the DOJ's case. I haven't reviewed it in great detail, but I do wonder why it's coming now.
Follow that up with a question from Reed in Santa Rosa. How does the guest curate his journalistic information input? Newspaper subscriptions, Substacks, podcasts?
Another good question. I start every morning. I do look at the Washington Post and the New York Times, which tend to these days piss me off frequently because of their credulous views of fascism rising in America. But they're the best we have, and by criticizing them, we want them to be better. I watch MSNBC pretty much all the time. One of the things I'm proud of doing when I was at CUNY, I used some money to a young woman you ought to have on the show, if I may be so bold as to say, named Julia Jeske, who started a service called Decoding Fox News. She watches Fox News, so we don't have to. So I follow her to see what's going on Fox News, what people are hearing and not hearing. And then I obviously look at social media and I go across now. Yes, I'm still on X because there are communities there that have not left, but Blue Sky, which I like, and Mastodon and Threads and lesser Facebook and more LinkedIn. And I look at what people I respect and trust are linking to. I listen to podcasts. I do subscribe to things, but I can't subscribe to everything. And I worry that we have a redlining of journalism going on in which all of the useful journalism is retreating behind paywalls for a small audience. If you look at the LA Times right now, it reaches about 5% of the entire LA market or less. That's not something that serves the public. And journalism, if it all falls behind paywalls, doesn't serve the public. Again, I understand the need to eat. I understand the need to make this work. And we could have a long discussion about business models and efficiency and so on. But we as journalists need to look at our larger responsibility to the news and information ecosystem in which we live.
Wouldn't it be advisable, though, to listen, for example, to Fox News, as repugnant as it might be to you, to know how the enemy thinks and what is going out there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My dear departed father, who died a year ago at the age of 97, when he lived in Florida, watched Fox News regularly. And then COVID hit, and we didn't know that his hearing aid stopped working. By the time we finally got him moved up to New Jersey, where I live, he had been deprogrammed. He had, for the first time in his life, voted for a Democrat, Joe Biden, and uncomplainingly watched MSNBC. Yes, it's important to see. This is why I paid Julia Jeske to start her own venture to watch Fox News, because it is critical. I haven't been on MSNBC in a few years, but when I was on, I used to say, why don't you do this, MSNBC? Why don't you tell us what that part of America is seeing and, importantly, not seeing? So I think it's important, but I can't bear to watch it all the time. It would drive me crazy.
Here's Roscoe from Madison. Well, yeah, it's like having a lobotomy sometimes. Here's Roscoe from Madison, Indiana. Do you see any way to fine-tune a large language model without imposing a worldview on the output? Thank you for the question.
Really, really fascinating question. And I just wrote about this in a thread, and then I put it on my blog at buzzmachine.com. Try to address just that question. Large language models start by being taught on some large compilation of our digital text. And that necessarily is going to reflect the views of those who had the power to publish in the past. So it necessarily brings biases. That's one level of bias. Then, however, when we interact with that in various ways, we expose further, not the machine's biases, but ours. When Google came along and said, and I think this is right to do, to its Gemini, don't constantly show just white people when you're asked. And that's why Gemini showed a black man at the table creating the American Constitution, which was wishful thinking and should have been the way it was. Of course, it wasn't. And then it got in trouble, and they took down the images, and they said they went overboard. Well, it revealed something about us that Google tried to adjust for that. Then it revealed something about the other end of the political spectrum when they accused Google of being woke and commie and everything else and putting DEI in. All of those cases say nothing about the technology and everything about us. And so I think what's interesting here, what I've been concentrating on lately is asking, what does AI reflect about us in what it feeds back to us in our own words and cliches and biases, in what we ask it to do and how we use it, and in our reaction to it, what we're scared of about it, what we are hopeful of about it. I think AI is a very large and often cracked mirror to us.
We just, our most recent podcast, we were talking about AI with a medical doctor, and he was saying that AI actually has been tested to show more empathy in the languages that used than human beings do. I mean, we're in some really gray territory that we have to sort out here. Same with this next question. This Jerry in Aurora, Colorado says, you just said half the country will vote for an insane man. Are you a practicing psychiatrist?
I don't need to be, Jerry. The judgment stands.
And then we'll follow with another question from Madison, Indiana. Roscoe wants to know, should we create tools to increase large language model transparency?
Yes. One thing I recommend highly is a paper that was written by Timnit Gebru, Margaret Mitchell, and Emily Bender, and a fourth person whose name I always forget, with apologies, called the Stochastic Parrots paper. Two of them were at Google. They got fired as a result, which was unfortunate, in which they argued that large language models should not be nearly so large as they are, because it makes it impossible to audit what goes into them and the results. Jan LeCun, who's in charge of AI at Meta, is arguing for smaller models. People who I think are smart in AI are arguing for open source so that we can do this. On the other hand, I watched the keynote for Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, which makes most of the chips for AI, for one of the podcasts I'm on. And it was, what's the word I'm looking for? Awe-inspiring, good and bad, to look at the scale of these things. The next chip is so hugely powerful. And they have this visualization where they put that chip next to another one, and that can do more than, God knows any computer we can imagine. And then they stack a whole bunch of them up in a rack, and then they have rack after rack after row after row. And my God, the computing power of that. And Wong said, well, you're going to have to get a lot of data to fill that up. That's the wrong way to go. That means that you're going to have too much to understand, too much to monitor, too much to audit. And they don't need to be that big, is the point of the Stochastic Parents paper. And they also, when you get that big, they use tremendous amounts of energy, and they're harder to tune and all kinds of other things. So yes, I think we need more transparency. However, I don't think that that's going to reveal many answers. When it came to social media, people said, show us the algorithm. Okay, fine. I wish at some point Meta had just given a printout of 5,000 pages and say, here it is. You figure it out. It's a meaningless transparency at some level. What we need to do instead is look at the effect, the output, and the impact of this. And to do that, what we really need is researchers to have availability of data.
What we really need, I think, was a plaintive cry from you. Why can't we be like Norway? It sounds like Bernie Sanders a little bit. Schibsted is the model for us, for you.
Well, in one way. So we have in the United States, we have the New York Times suing OpenAI, saying, take down our stuff and pay us and license it for it and spread copyright broader and shrink fair use. I interviewed Sven Sturmer Taulo on our podcast, AI Inside. I'm on two of them. And he's the CTO of Schibsted, which is a very much admired Norwegian news company. And he said, listen, our archives aren't that valuable. Fine. If they use them, he said, well, I don't necessarily want a big pot of gold. What I want is access to the technology, which is a very smart way to look at this, to say, let's figure out how we can get smarter in the future. And Schibsted is very strategic and very wise about how they use the technology rather than trying to act like a victim of it, which too much American media do.
How do we curtail that? If American media is looking at itself as a victim?
I think, one thing I do is ridicule them for it and try to make fun of them for it, but also other suggestions. So I keep mentioning this paper that will come out in a week or so on the California Journalism Protection Act. At the end of it, I try to come up with a bunch of alternative views, which is about trying to create a more productive and collaborative news ecosystem. It's not about saving one publication. It's about how informed our communities are at large and how we have many tools now to grapple with that.
From Roscoe again, AI effect. There is plenty of curiosity about large language models, but can we definitively say whether their use will increase our curiosity about a subject or might it dull our curiosity as we get repetitive results?
So true. I think that the AI has many really interesting possibilities. The first two, I think, are wrong. To have put AI next to search was wrong because we expect search to deliver us something back that is credible, and AI is not credible, has no sense of meaning, no sense of fact, which also means it shouldn't be writing news stories on its own as it has for companies like CNET and Geo Media and Sports Illustrated. However, AI can do other things that I think will be interesting if it becomes an adjunct to us. So my friend Matthew Kirschenbaum at University of Maryland wrote a great essay in The Atlantic about what he called the textpocalypse, that when they want to fill those vast machines and there's not enough human text to do it, they're going to make up text and the AI is going to feed on what it makes. And we're going to end up with a gray goo, he says. And I think that's right. Versus a lot of uses of AI can be things that help us with our own work. So Google has a product called Notebook LM, and Stephen Johnson, a wonderful author, is the editorial director there. You can put in a whole bunch of documents and transcripts and things, and then query that data and ask it questions about the information, and get things that you might not have seen on your own. That's useful. I talked to one editor about sending out citizens to record 100 school board meetings across the state, and then put that into the AI and query that and say how many of them are trying to ban books. Or how many are talking about the mental health of our young people. There's lots of uses I can imagine for AI. When I was at that World Economic Forum event in San Francisco, the argument was made in a breakout group I was in, was that AI can raise the floor. It can help people do what they otherwise couldn't do, didn't know how to do. Like I can't code, but now I can tell a computer what to do. They can scale. You can have 100 school board meetings, which you don't have 100 reporters to do it. It also raises the ceiling, lets us do things that we, in fact, were not capable of doing, like analyzing protein folds. We can look at, and by the way, the effect of all this is going to be uneven. Bad guys can use it too and also scale. And it is going to affect some jobs and rob some people of their sense of purpose, maybe writers. But I think that there are uses of it as a tool. And if we look at the printing press as a tool and what we did with it, and engraving as a tool, and the camera as a tool, the camera freaked out illustrators when it came along, but it also made a lot of art. And I think we have to look at AI as something that is a tool that we can use, and all the better because now we can speak to it in our language.
A lot of people thought the camera would kill painting. Didn't quite do that, though, did it? I'm thinking again about the book and the sense that the book will become history. People just love to hold a book in their hands sometimes and like the interaction with text. Google, do no evil. I didn't know Stephen Johnson was working for Google now, too. I mean, I've got lots of people in the stables there, and are they really committed, do you think, to that notion?
Years ago, Eric Schmidt, who was then the CEO of the company, the minder, said that Google's problem was its success and its size. It will grow so big that it would be trouble to steer the ship. It would also be the target of everyone's distrust of the internet as a whole. And I think that's proven out to be true. Google's still a fascinating company. I use a hell of a lot of its services. I use Gmail every day and search every day, and my phone is an Android, and I love my Chromebook. So I still like Google, but it's becoming better known for killing services than starting them. It's become nervous about its own AI recently, for example, because it is the target of such criticism. I think it is less bold than it used to be, and there's reasons for that. I think they're still pretty sincere. The argument about Don't Be Evil was that it was a license to employees to stop the company from doing something that would be bad. And I've heard discussions among Googlers where they've done that.
Well, let me give you an interesting example to at least think about or have you ruminate on, and that is, I did a few interviews with Eric Schmidt, and he was very smart, very capable, and impressive guy, to be understating. But when calls would come in criticizing Google and so forth, you felt that he was really tough, running over them. You feel that way about somebody like Musk, too. He talks a lot about
yes.
Everything's going to be open and but somebody criticizes Musk, boom, He did that with Don Lemon. Don Lemon just brought up stuff in an interview. He was going to supposedly have Don Lemon on a regular basis on X, and he decided not to because Don Lemon was asking him some questions he felt were uncomfortable. So the idea is, we're on the top and we're going to run roughshod over any competition. You're living in that world. It's a world of piranha, really, or barracuda, use your metaphor, in the animal world. And so taking criticism of any kind becomes something that you just flake off.
In my next book out this fall called The Web We Weave, I look at my own mistakes. And I think I was, like the technology industry, too optimistic about how technology would be used or misused. I also think that it was a huge mistake to grant too much power to a few companies and people. And Musk taught us that when he took over much of public discourse. I'm sorry, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I'm going to say it. He's a narcissistic nihilist. And what he's done to public discourse is dangerous. And so I wish that I had held closer to my blog. I wish I'd come sooner to Mastodon, which is open source. I think that the essence of the internet is open source and open, and we've got to go back to there. So in that next book, one of the chapter headings or the subheadings is that it's time to demote the geeks. As I said earlier in our conversation, I think there comes a moment when the technologists fade into the background and we are more in charge, we normal people. And we've got to drive for that moment sooner than later.
We got a lot of bad actors, though. Not only the geeks aren't often the bad actors. The bad actors are out there.
They're always going to be out there. And so one of the mistakes that was made by the early days of the internet was too much faith in not the technology, but humanity. Not enough awareness about what could be done by malign actors. And it's not as if you can guard against all of them beforehand. You're always going to be one step behind, but you hope to be no more than one step behind. And you've got to recognize that things will be manipulated. They will be used by malign actors. They will look for weaknesses in the systems. And it's an unfortunate reality of humanity, but we've got to recognize that.
One last question from one of our most loyal and regular contributors to Questions, Reed in Santa Rosa, who says, AI will benefit or harm our libraries?
I don't know, Reed. I certainly am on Team Library. And I think in the long run, I think it will benefit them. Because I think that as the internet brought people to more books, right? The fear when Google scanned books was that the books would be harmed. But in fact, books from backlists were discovered in ways they couldn't before because of search. and there are better sales of backlist books. I think the AI has the potential to, number one, create more curiosity, and a library is a place to answer that. Number two, because AI cannot, large language models as presently built, cannot do facts, librarians become all the more useful to teach people how to judge the output of AI. And so, and libraries have so much to do now that's more than information. It's about community, and it's about sometimes the poorest among us and our young. And I think all those become more important than ever. So in my book, I argue that libraries should be a key institution to support in this time of change.
Well, let me first extend my thanks to all of you who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and ditto to all who will be listening on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. And if you aren't yet a member of this podcast, I urge you to join by going to our website, graymatter.show, where you can find any of our previous episodes, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to email any questions, responses, or reactions you may have to me, M. Krasny, at graymatter.show. My thanks to the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Jeff, Kevin, Colin, and Colleen. And special thanks to this week's special guest, Jeff Jarvis. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.